They say the loudest moments in life aren't always the ones with shouting. Sometimes it's the hush, the soft sigh behind a closed door, the silence when someone chooses not to look you in the eye, the quiet step of your own shoes as you walk away not because you want to, but because you've been told you no longer belong. My name is Evelyn Grace Thompson. I was 72 when my son Jason asked me to leave his house. There was no argument, no raised voices, just a sentence plain and tight like an old belt mom. We can't carry you anymore. That word carry it sat in my chest like a rock. I'd spent most of my life carrying him. Through fevers and homework and heartbreak. Through Christmases without his father and birthdays where the only gift I could give was my time and my hope. And now suddenly I was too heavy. They didn't slam the door behind me. It clicked. Soft, clean, final. I suppose some would say that was kind, but a soft door can break your heart just the same. I stepped off their porch with a suitcase that had seen more life than most people do. Its wheels stuttered on the concrete like they too were reluctant to move forward. Jason's wife Melissa didn't say much. She didn't have to. That half smile on her face said it all. The kind people wear when the mess is finally off their carpet. I didn't cry. Not then. Not when my legs began to ache halfway down Maple Street. Not even when I sat on the same wooden bus bench where I used to wait for Jason's kindergarten shuttle. Funny thing about motherhood, it prepares you for scraped knees, growing pains, broken curfews. But it never prepares you for erasure. I folded my hands in my lap and stared straight ahead like the trees across the street might offer me an answer. Or at least remember me. No one came after me. No one called out. And yet, in my purse buried beneath tissues, peppermint candies, and an old photo of Jason as a baby dressed like a pumpkin, was something no one knew about. A debit card, connected to a trust account, and in that account, $1.4 million. No, I hadn't won the lottery. No, I hadn't robbed a bank. I had simply waited, listened, and remembered. The truth is, I wasn't fired. A few months before that day, I had left the church thrift shop I'd worked at for nearly 2 decades. My back had started to give out. The doctor warned me lifting boxes like that could put me in a wheelchair. So I handed in my apron, thanked the pastor, and walked out of that little back room for the last time with no fanfare. He begged me to stay. I told him I needed rest, but not the kind that comes with naps. I needed the kind of rest that only comes when you stop proving yourself to others. To your children, to the version of you that believed your love would always be enough. Jason never asked why I stopped working, he assumed. And Melissa, well, she always kept a calculator in her mind. To them, I was a cost. But behind their spreadsheets, they never saw the line item labeled, everything I ever gave. I had scrubbed motel bathtubs, served mashed potatoes in hospital cafeterias, said no to new shoes so Jason could have textbooks, stayed up late sewing torn sleeves and patching invisible holes in clothes in budgets and dreams. And now I was excess, but I didn't hate them. I couldn't. Because you don't stop loving someone simply because they stop seeing you. You just learn how to hold that love differently, closer to the chest, quieter. At the bus stop, I reached into my purse and pulled out a yellowed slip of paper I'd folded and unfolded more times than I could count. A land deed, 40 acres, middle of nowhere, no electricity, no plumbing, left to me decades ago by an uncle no one talked about. Everyone said it was worthless. Sell it for a couple thousand, they said. But I didn't. Every year, I scraped together enough to pay the property taxes, even when I couldn't afford heating oil, even when my shoes had cardboard inside to hide the holes. Not because I thought the land was valuable, but because something in my gut whispered, hold on. And that whisper, it was right, because last year, a man in a suit with shiny shoes came to the church, said a solar company needed my land, something about sunlight patterns, government contracts. I asked only one question, can this stay private? 3 weeks later, a trust fund quietly named after my late husband was filled with $1.4 million. No one knew. Not Jason, not Melissa, not the ladies at the thrift store who still called me Sweet Miss Evelyn. And I liked it that way. Because this money, it wasn't for revenge. It wasn't for proving anyone wrong. It was for building something that couldn't throw people away. Something I'd never had. A place where people with empty hands were still seen as whole. That night, with a bank account full of quiet power and a heart still bruised from rejection, I didn't check into a hotel. I could have. 5 stars if I wanted. Room service, warm towels, someone to call me ma'am and ask if I needed anything. But I didn't want luxury. I wanted truth. So I walked into a women's shelter on the edge of town not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I needed to remember what real looked like. The woman at the desk didn't ask for ID. She looked me in the eyes and said, "Do you need a place to sleep tonight, honey?" I nodded, that was all. And for the first time in months, I felt seen. The room was simple, creaky cot, scratchy blanket, and a window that wouldn't quite close. But I slept like I hadn't in years. Not because it was soft, but because it was safe. There were other women there, some young with eyes too old, some my age with eyes still searching. We shared crackers from a crinkled sleeve someone had donated. We passed stories like patchwork quilts, each torn but treasured. One woman wept quietly over a daughter who hadn't called in 5 years. Another told a joke that made us all laugh until we forgot where we were. And in that dimly lit room with peeling walls, I realized something no amount of savings could buy. I was not alone. The next morning, I did something I'd been dreaming about since my knees stopped working right. I visited an old cottage on the outskirts of town. Most people saw it as a teardown. Cracked windows, rusted gutters, wild weeds growing up the sides like ivy reclaiming its own. The mailbox was missing. The steps moaned under every footfall. But I saw something else. I saw beginnings. I paid cash. No questions, no inspections, no attention. 3 weeks later, that cottage wasn't the same. New paint, the soft kind that looks like early morning sky. A fixed roof with solar panels. Flower beds with herbs and sunflowers taller than any child I'd ever held. But here's the thing. I didn't put my name on it. Not Evelyn Thompson, not Mizzy, not even the trust I'd quietly set up in my husband's name. Instead, I created something new, Grace Holdings LLC. Not for secrecy, but for protection from pride, from gossip, from the kind of curiosity that isn't really curious, just nosy. This house wasn't meant to be a monument. It was meant to be a seed. You see, people think starting over requires drama, big speeches, declarations, second chances at center stage. But I've learned the real changes come when no one's watching. I started volunteering again. At food pantries, at the shelter that had taken me in, at the youth center where the lights flickered and the roof leaked. I never said I can help you financially. I just asked, what do you need? They'd talk about leaky pipes, broken shelves, cold floors, and the next week those problems would quietly be solved. No ribbon cuttings, no dedications. I'd sign the checks under names no one recognized, because this wasn't about legacy. It was about dignity. Months passed, seasons shifted, and one day I stood in front of an old boarded-up building in the middle of downtown, a former community hall, forgotten, dusty, broken. But it whispered to me. I walked through the cracked double doors and felt the echoes. Children's footsteps, elders dancing slow to soft music, soup bubbling in the kitchen, laughter, memory. And I knew, this was it. I bought it, quietly repaired the roof, scrubbed every inch of tile with my own hands. And when it was done, I opened the doors. No banners, no press, just a sign above the entry that read, Evelyn's Table, everyone has a place. We didn't check income. We didn't ask for paperwork. We didn't require your story to be sad enough. We just welcomed. Hot soup every afternoon, clean cots for those who needed rest, books, music, smiles that weren't afraid to linger. Children ran barefoot through the garden behind the building. Elders napped on warm couches without shame. People held hands at dinner even if they'd met just that morning. And me? I didn't run it like a boss. I ran it like a mother. The kind who remembers every name, every allergy, every story someone thought no one else remembered. People often ask, why didn't you tell Jason? Why didn't you show him that you were okay? The answer is simple. Because I needed to really know who he was when he thought I had nothing left to offer. Because sometimes the only way to see someone clearly is to disappear from their reflection. But even as Evelyn's Table grew, even as we fed hundreds, sheltered dozens, healed more than I'll ever truly understand, there was still one person I hadn't fed. One person I hadn't forgiven. And that, dear listener, was myself. Because no matter how strong we are, there's always that one bruise that refuses to fade. It had been almost 2 years since I last saw my son. 2 years since the door clicked shut behind me, since I walked away with a suitcase and a quiet decision to stop begging for space in someone else's home. In those 2 years, Evelyn's Table had grown roots deeper than I imagined. We had music nights on Fridays, not loud, just enough to make your shoulders drop. Local teens played old guitars. A retired nurse read poems she wrote in secret. Children danced with plastic crowns and peanut butter on their cheeks. It wasn't just a shelter. It had become a rhythm, a soft drumbeat of healing in a world that often forgot how to listen. I thought I had found peace, but peace I've learned is not a locked box you hide inside. It's a river. And sometimes it brings things back to you. One rainy afternoon, the kind that makes everything smell like childhood, I was in the kitchen slicing bread for soup night. Margie, our volunteer receptionist, called out, "Miss Evelyn, someone's here to see you." I didn't expect the name she said. Jason. For a moment I thought she meant someone named Jason, a guest maybe, a volunteer. Not my Jason. But when I turned the corner there, he stood. His frame was thinner, like life had been chiseling away at him. Hair unkempt, eyes sunken not from age, but from the weight of regret. He was holding a flyer, the kind we posted at libraries and food banks. I recognized the cream-colored paper, the little wooden spoon logo at the corner. He looked smaller somehow, not in stature, but in certainty. I froze towel and one hand knife still on the counter. He didn't speak right away, didn't say hi mom or I'm sorry, didn't even look me in the eyes. He just whispered I didn't know where else to go. I walked toward him slowly, not because I was scared, but because I needed to feel the ground beneath me. He smelled like rain and old sweat, a scent I remembered from when he was 8 after soccer practice, when I'd wrap him in a towel and pretend not to gag. But this time, there was no towel, no safe home waiting, only this moment. He said Melissa had left, took the kids, he'd lost the house, couldn't keep up with the bills. He told me, odd jobs, side gigs, but nothing stuck. He looked at me then, really looked at me. And I saw it the boy who once asked me if monsters were real and the man who had become one to his own mother without knowing. I didn't raise my voice, didn't ask why, didn't say I told you so. Instead, I said, you look cold, come inside. I led him to a table, poured him tea, set a small plate of soup and bread in front of him like it was any other guest. Because at Evelyn's table, everyone is fed, including the ones who starved us. He looked around slowly, his eyes lingering on the mural on the far wall, a watercolor of sunflowers and warm skies painted by a group of shelter kids with more heart than technique. This place, he said, it's yours. I nodded. He swallowed hard. I thought you had nothing. I smiled gently. I had peace, I said, and enough. He blinked. Why didn't you tell me that you had money, that you were okay? I sat across from him, folding my hands like I used to when waiting for parent-teacher conferences. Would it have changed anything, I asked. He didn't answer, and I knew that silence was his answer. I looked him in the eye, those same eyes I once watched learn how to read, once watched blink away tears after he broke his arm falling off the jungle gym. I needed to know, I said, who would stand by me when I had nothing to give. He dropped his gaze to the table. I was awful to you, he whispered. You trusted me, and I threw you out. I reached for his hand. You forgot yourself, I said, but that doesn't mean you can't find your way back. And in that moment, something broke. Not loudly, not like shattered glass, more like a thread coming undone at the seam, quietly but entirely. He wept, a grown man weeping in the shelter his mother built not for herself, but for anyone who had ever been forgotten. It wasn't dramatic, no heaving sobs, just a stream of tears that made the air taste clean. And I sat with him hand in hand as the rain outside tapped gently against the window, like the world was saying, it's okay now. You can begin again. Spring arrived that year like it had something to prove. It didn't burst in. It tiptoed soft rains, green buds, early light creeping through lace curtains at dawn. The kind of spring that doesn't ask for attention, only offers quiet hope. Jason began showing up every day after that. He never asked for money, never assumed he was owed anything, and I never handed him anything but gloves and a list of chores. He cleaned gutters, painted fences, fixed wobbly chairs and squeaky doors. He worked like a man trying to patch more than just wood. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't need to, because real healing doesn't always come with speeches. Sometimes it comes with shared silence and a new coat of paint. The children loved him. They called him Mr. J and fought to carry his toolbox. They didn't know his story, didn't know he had once sent me away. They only knew he made paper airplanes fly better than anyone else. One afternoon, I found him kneeling beside a child, teaching her how to plant lavender. He looked up at me, dirt on his cheeks, sweat on his collar. And I saw it. Not the son who threw me out, not the man who failed, but the boy I once raised, curious, gentle, full of belief that things could grow again if you were willing to get your hands dirty. A few weeks later, on a warm Friday evening, I handed him an envelope. It was thick, sealed. I didn't explain, just said, take it when you're ready. He looked puzzled. I just smiled and went back to stirring the stew. That night, after the dishes were done and the last of the guests had fallen asleep on clean cots under secondhand quilts, Jason came to find me. I was on the porch wrapped in my shawl, sipping lukewarm tea that had long lost its flavor but kept my hands busy. He sat beside me and opened the envelope. Inside were 2 things. The original deed to the house I'd once given him, and a voided check, the first installment from the land sale that built all of this. He stared at them for a long time, didn't speak. And finally, he looked at me with eyes wide, not from surprise, but from shame. "I don't deserve this," he said. "I know," I replied, "but that's not why I gave it." He looked at me waiting, so I explained. "This deed," I said, tapping the paper gently, "was never really about property. It was about legacy, about trust, about what we give to the people we believe in, hoping they'll make something better out of it." "And the check?" he asked. I smiled. "That's just a piece of paper, but what it built Evelyn's table, that's something real. Something I never could have built if I was still waiting to be seen, still hoping someone else would tell me I mattered." He blinked quickly, his hands were shaking. "You don't owe me anything," I told him, "but now you know what happens when love comes before pride." The moon was bright that night. It cast soft shadows on the porch, made everything glow like a memory. Jason didn't say a word after that. He just leaned back in the chair beside mine. And we sat like that for a long time. Not mother and son trying to fix the past, not two broken people hoping for a miracle. Just two souls finally quiet enough to hear the same rhythm in their hearts again. Weeks passed. Jason kept showing up, not because he had to, because he wanted to. He greeted guests at the door, served soup, organized supply closets, even taught a few teens how to fix bikes. I watched him and I remembered something a pastor once told me: redemption doesn't need applause. It just needs presence. And Jason, he was present. Fully, honestly, finally. That summer, the air smelled like rosemary and warm bread. The garden behind Evelyn's table had bloomed beyond anyone's expectations. Bees humming sunflowers, swaying, and tiny hands clutching tomatoes like treasure. We didn't run ads, didn't hang fancy signs. But somehow people found us. Mothers with babies, veterans with stories they didn't want to tell but needed someone to hear. Young men afraid to cry, old women who had run out of places to be soft. They came with empty hands, and we met them with full ones. No one asked, "How did you end up here?" We only asked, "How can we help you stay a while?" Jason had become part of the heartbeat. He repaired the cracked linoleum in the pantry. He held umbrellas over elders in the rain. He quietly handed out winter coats before anyone realized the cold had crept in. And he never once asked for praise. Because the thing about regret is when it's real, it teaches you humility. I didn't lecture him, didn't take credit for his return. I just let him rediscover who he might have been if the world hadn't convinced him that love had to be earned. One evening, I found him folding blankets in the supply room. He paused and looked up at me. "Do you think I've changed?" I thought for a moment. And then I said, "I think you're remembering." He furrowed his brow. "Remembering what? Who you were," I replied. "Before the world told you that being strong meant closing doors." He sat with that, didn't argue, didn't explain. Because deep down, he knew I was right. People often ask why I never made Evelyn's table about me. Why there's no portrait, no plaque, no photo of me in the lobby. I tell them the truth. I didn't build this place to be remembered. I built it so others could be. Too many places forget the quiet ones, the ones who keep showing up even when they've been pushed aside, the ones who love without applause, the ones who survive quietly not because they're weak, but because they refuse to become cruel. I wanted Evelyn's table to be a home for those people. Because I am those people, and yet even without intention, a legacy began to form. Not the kind made of bronze statues or newspaper articles, but the kind made of soup recipes passed down between volunteers, of children who learned to share because someone showed them how, of nights when someone wept at the table and didn't have to explain why. A man once stopped me on the sidewalk and said, "You don't know this, but your place saved my brother's life." I smiled and replied, "I didn't save anyone. I just opened the door." That's all any of us can do, really. We can't fix every wound, can't undo every unkind word, but we can make spaces where healing is possible, where shame isn't the price of entry, where love isn't measured in usefulness. And in that sense, Jason had begun to build his own legacy too, one quiet deed at a time. That fall, the wind changed. You can feel it when you're older, not just the air shifting, but the bones of the world turning inward. Like nature itself is tucking in, settling, preparing. I began to slow down, not in a dramatic way, not with hospital beds or tubes, just slower. I took longer walks, sipped my tea instead of drinking it. I watched the leaves fall like they were old letters from friends, each one soft, necessary, honest. Jason noticed. He started coming in earlier, staying later. He'd say things like, "You rest, I've got this," or "Take your time, mama." He hadn't called me that in decades. Funny how some names return to you when the soul begins to remember. He started asking questions too about the recipes, the volunteer schedules, the budget. At first I thought he was just being thorough. But one evening as we sat folding laundry on the front porch, he said, "What happens to this place when you're gone?" I looked out at the twilight. Children were chasing fireflies. The soup pot inside still simmered. The lights cast golden shadows on the sidewalk. And I said, "That depends on you." He didn't answer right away, just kept folding. Towels, aprons, the quiet layers of ordinary life. Then he whispered, "I want to carry it. Not for me, for you, for them." And I smiled. Because I believed him. Because he had finally stopped asking for inheritance and started asking for responsibility. There's a difference. In the weeks that followed, I began writing things down. Not legal documents, I'd already handled those. Not instructions, the team didn't need micromanaging. What I wrote were thoughts, stories, reflections about what I'd learned from watching people eat when they hadn't eaten in days. About how the smallest acts, a warm blanket, a name, remembered a slice of fresh apple, could undo years of loneliness. I wrote these things not because I thought they were profound, but because I didn't want the next generation to forget the small truths, the kind you can only learn by listening, by serving, by staying when it's uncomfortable. One morning I didn't wake up. No pain, no panic, just stillness. Like the kind you hear in churches before the choir begins, like the hush before a garden blooms. Jason found me in my bed. The window was open. The curtains were dancing gently like they didn't want to disturb me. He told me later that he sat beside me for hours. Didn't cry right away, didn't call anyone. Just sat, held my hand, told me all the things he should have said long ago, even if I couldn't respond. He said he felt me there, and I believe him. Because love once planted does not vanish. It roots, it lingers, it grows in those who are ready. My service was small just the way I wanted. A simple wooden table, a bouquet of garden flowers, no suits, no drama. Just people from shelters, from schools, from the neighborhoods no one photographs. People who knew, who felt, who remembered the warmth of a bowl of soup placed in front of them with no questions asked. Jason stood up holding my apron. It was stained, worn, and still smelled faintly of rosemary and onions. And he said, "My mother once walked out of a house with nothing but a suitcase, and in that silence she built something bigger than any of us ever knew." After the service, people lingered, not out of obligation, but because they didn't want to leave the space her life had made. A few volunteers lit candles around the porch. Some children from the garden brought wildflowers, sunflowers, mostly taller than themselves. Jason stood by the door for hours. Not as a host, not as her son, just as a man who understood finally that grief isn't about losing what was. It's about becoming what was loved. The weeks after her passing were tender. Jason didn't rush to fill her shoes. He swept the steps before opening, made the coffee too strong, overcooked the rice more than once. But he kept showing up, and others followed his steadiness. They began to call him Mr. Jason the way they once called her Miss Evelyn. He didn't try to be her. That's the thing about great people, they don't need replacements. They need witnesses. He started a journal not for himself but for the next person. A little red book kept behind the front desk. It held stories. What to do when the freezer hums too loud. Which brand of tomato paste Miss Evelyn preferred. How to spot someone who's smiling but starving. He called it Evelyn's Notes, and every volunteer who came after added their own lines until the pages felt like fingerprints layered imperfect real. The table stayed full. People still came, new faces, old ones, some who'd left but found their way back. They came not because of the food, but because the place itself had memory. A spirit, an energy that whispered, "You're safe here. You matter." Jason made no grand announcements, no rebranding, no changes. He just kept the doors open, and over time, Evelyn's table became something more than a shelter. It became a story. A college student wrote a paper about it. A small podcast featured it. A retired teacher painted it in watercolors and gave prints to the staff. None of it went viral, but it didn't need to. Because real change doesn't happen in headlines. It happens in casseroles left on a doorstep, in a cot made with clean sheets, in someone finally saying, "I'm tired," and hearing back, "That's okay." Jason kept a framed photo of his mother in the office, not a professional one, just a candid, her laughing mid-blink flower on her apron. He often said, "That's how I remember her best," halfway between a joke and a soup recipe. One night, a young woman sat at the table crying. Jason brought her tea. She asked who built this place. He hesitated, then pointed to the photo. "She did," he said, "and she didn't build it for herself. She built it for the people the world doesn't see." The girl wiped her tears, and for the first time in days smiled. As the seasons cycled on, so did the stories. At Evelyn's table, they came in like weather, some loud, some soft, some passing quickly, others lingering for months. There were reunions in our halls, siblings who hadn't spoken in years, women escaping storms with nothing but their children and courage, Men who carried guilt heavier than any duffel, learning how to sit with silence again. And through it all there was Evelyn, not in body but in spirit, in the way the curtains were tied back each morning, in the handwritten labels on the herb jars, in the soft music that played while dinner was served. Evelyn had taught us all something rare, that power can come from stillness, that legacy doesn't require wealth or recognition, just intention. Jason found new strength in stillness. He became quieter but not smaller. He spoke with less urgency, more care. The kind of man who lets a child finish a sentence. The kind who knows healing doesn't need to be hurried. He started teaching free workshops, how to build things, repair old bicycles, even bake bread. Not because anyone asked, but because it's what Evelyn would have done. He didn't lead with his title. He led with his hands. One evening, a group from a neighboring town visited. They'd heard about Evelyn's table and wanted to create something similar. They asked questions, took notes. And before they left, one woman asked, what made her do it? Why didn't she just live her life and let others be? Jason paused, then replied, because she knew what it felt like to be thrown away. He continued. She didn't build this place to prove a point. She built it so no one else would feel the way she once did, invisible, discarded, forgotten by the very people she gave everything to. The room fell silent, and in that silence, you could feel her. Like a soft breath between sentences, like a hand on your back when you think you're alone. After they left, Jason returned to the porch. The stars were out. A chill clung to the night. He sat on the same bench where Evelyn once watched the children play, closed his eyes, and whispered, I see you now. Because he did. Not just the mother, not the woman who made his lunches or scrubbed the floors, but the soul quiet, patient, unshaken, a woman who could have chosen revenge, but instead chose love, chose to build instead of destroy, to nurture instead of punish. And in doing so, she became the kind of person the world almost missed, but never will again. There's something sacred about a place that's been touched by pain and repurposed with love. Evelyn's table became that sacred ground, not just for the people who needed shelter, but for those who needed reminding that they still mattered, that mistakes don't mean exile, that softness can survive even after the world has gone hard. Jason learned that most of all, because every time he handed a child a bowl of soup, he was feeding a version of himself. The child who once had everything given, the man who once gave nothing in return. And somehow through service, he was stitching together the fabric of who he wanted to become. They say grief changes you. But what they don't say is that sometimes grief gives you the instructions you never had. Jason began to mentor the young men who came through the door, not with lectures, but with presence. He showed up, taught them how to patch drywall, listened without judgment when one confessed he hadn't seen his own mother in years. He didn't preach Evelyn's name, he lived her memory. And through him, she became more than a woman. She became a thread woven into every act of kindness, every repair, every lullaby hummed in the quiet corners of the shelter. Years passed. The garden bloomed wider. A second building was purchased next door for women with newborns. A tutoring program was started in the evenings. And still no press, no fame, just community, genuine stitched together with care kind of community. The kind that grows not from funding, but from remembering. Remembering what Evelyn always knew, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is sit beside someone in their worst moment and say, you're not alone. One chilly morning in early spring, a little girl named Nora tugged Jason's sleeve. She'd been staying at the shelter with her mother for a few weeks. She asked who made this place. Jason knelt beside her and pointed to the sign above the door. Evelyn, he said. She made it for people who needed a table when the world gave them a floor. Nora blinked. Where is she? Jason smiled softly. She's everywhere. That night, Jason sat with the journal again, the red one behind the desk. He added a new line at the bottom of a page already filled with gratitude notes and soup tweaks. Love does not vanish, it multiplies. And then he turned off the lights, made his final round, and stood alone in the kitchen. He placed his hand on the counter where Evelyn had once taught him how to knead dough, and whispered thank you. Not just for the shelter, not just for the second chance, but for seeing him even when he forgot how to see her. Years from now, they may not remember Evelyn's full name. They might forget what she looked like, how her hair was always tied back with the same faded ribbon, or how her laugh sounded like wind through lace curtains. But they will remember what she left behind. Not the money, not the land, not even the buildings, but the invitation, the open door, the seat at the table, the feeling of being welcomed when the world had turned cold. Jason still runs Evelyn's table, though he insists no one calls him director or boss. Just Jason. He arrives before the sun opens, the windows, lights the stove, and lets the morning in. Sometimes he reads from his mother's old journals before the guests arrive, not aloud, just quietly like a prayer between them. He keeps her apron in a shadow box near the kitchen door. It's not a monument, it's a reminder. A reminder of the woman who taught him that forgiveness is the strongest kind of inheritance. People come and go, the beds are full, the soup simmers, and every now and then someone new asks who was Evelyn. Jason always smiles before answering. He tells them she was the kind of person who could be thrown out with a suitcase and still use that exile to build a sanctuary. He never tells them everything, because Evelyn didn't need to be a legend. She needed to be understood. And that understanding lives in every hand Jason holds, every apology he forgives, every guest he looks in the eye without asking questions. One rainy afternoon, the kind where puddles form like little mirrors in the street, Jason stood under the carved archway, watching a young boy skip up the steps, soaked and smiling. Above them, in the wood, Evelyn had chosen years ago, the same words were etched. The doors that close behind you can never match the ones you open for others. Jason touched the frame as the boy ran past him, laughter echoing down the hall. He didn't need to say anything, because in that moment, with a full heart, a full table, and a story still unfolding, he was his mother's son. Not just by blood, but by belief, by love, by legacy.